They rejoined the others near the entrance. Keanu was chatting with Robert about motorcycle maintenance, but he looked up when Sandra approached. He could read her expressions better than most people, and whatever he saw in her face made him smile slightly. She seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. "Ready to go?" Keanu asked. "Yeah," Sandra said. "I think we're done here." Robert extended his hand and Sandra shook it warmly. "Thank you for giving us another chance," he said. "Your car will be delivered tomorrow afternoon, fully detailed and with a full tank. And Ms. Bullock, if you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to call me directly. I've put my personal number in your paperwork." "I appreciate that, Robert. And I'll be curious to hear how the training program goes. Maybe you could send me an update in a few months." "I'd be honored to," Robert said, looking genuinely pleased that she cared enough to follow up. Victoria stood nearby, not quite part of the goodbye, but not hiding away either. Sandra caught her eye one more time and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Victoria nodded back, and there was understanding in that simple exchange. They'd never be friends, probably would never see each other again, but they'd shared something meaningful today. A lesson, a moment of growth, a chance at something better. As Sandra and Keanu walked toward the exit, Chris hurried over from where he'd been standing with the couple. "Ms. Bullock, Mr. Reeves, I just wanted to say thank you for what you did today. I've learned more in the past hour than I learned in my entire training program when I started here." Keanu clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Just remember it, okay? Remember that every person who walks through that door is a real person with their own story. Treat them accordingly." "I will," Chris promised. They pushed through the glass doors into the warm California afternoon. The sun was lower now, painting everything in golden light. Sandra took a deep breath of the warm air and felt herself truly relaxing for the first time all day. "You handled that really well," Keanu said as they walked toward their cars. Sandra laughed. "I almost left 3 times. If you hadn't shown up, I probably would have. But you didn't. And now Victoria has a chance to actually grow as a person. Robert is implementing better training, and that kid Chris learned an important lesson early in his career. Plus, you got a great car out of it." "Always looking for the positive," Sandra teased. "That's so you," Keanu shrugged with that characteristic modesty. "Someone has to. The world's cynical enough as it is." They reached Sandra's current car, the older one she'd driven here in. She leaned against it, not quite ready to leave yet. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever get tired of it? Of having to be the good guy all the time? Of standing up for things and teaching lessons and being everyone's moral compass?" Keanu was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I don't think of it as being the good guy. I just try to do what feels right in the moment. And today, seeing my friend being treated badly, it felt right to say something." He smiled. "Besides, you would have done the same for me." "In a heartbeat," Sandra agreed. "And honestly, I don't think I taught anyone anything today. They taught themselves." Victoria had to confront her own behavior. Robert had to acknowledge the culture he'd created. "We just held up a mirror." Sandra thought about that. He was probably right. The real change had to come from within those people. She and Keanu had just been catalysts. "Well, thank you anyway," she said, "for being a catalyst, and for being a good friend. Always," Keanu said simply. They hugged goodbye, a warm embrace between two people who genuinely cared about each other. As Keanu pulled back, he added, "Let me know when the car gets delivered. I want to hear if they do a good job." "I will. And Keanu, stay the way you are, okay? The world needs more people like you." "The world needs more people like you too, Sandra. People who give second chances and see the best in others even when they're being treated badly." Sandra watched as Keanu walked to his motorcycle, put on his helmet, and rode off with a final wave. She stood there for a moment longer, processing everything that had happened. She'd come here to buy a car and ended up being part of something that might actually matter, not in a huge world-changing way, but in a small, personal way that could ripple out and affect other people. She thought about Victoria going through her sales records, confronting the reality of how she'd been treating people. She thought about Robert rethinking his management approach. She thought about Chris learning early in his career that how you treat people matters more than any sales technique or closing strategy. As Sandra got into her car and started the engine, she felt good. Not because she'd put anyone in their place or gotten some kind of revenge, but because maybe, just maybe, The next person who walked into that dealership in casual clothes would have a better experience than she'd had. Maybe they'd be greeted with a smile and genuine interest instead of judgment and dismissal. And really, that was all she'd ever wanted. Not special treatment because of who she was, but basic human decency extended to everyone regardless of who they were. The drive home was peaceful. Sandra put on some music and let herself think about the new car that would be arriving tomorrow. Dark blue, all the features she wanted, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. It was exactly what she'd been looking for. But more than that, she thought about the conversation she'd had with Victoria. The woman's willingness to look at her own behavior honestly, to commit to change, to do the hard work of becoming better. That took courage. Sandra knew plenty of people who would have just stayed defensive, blamed others, made excuses. The fact that Victoria had done the opposite gave Sandra hope. When she got home, Sandra made herself a cup of tea and sat on her back porch, watching the sunset. Her phone buzzed with a text from Keanu. "Made it home okay. Been thinking about today. You were really gracious with Victoria. Not everyone would have been." Sandra smiled and typed back. She seemed genuinely willing to change. "That matters. It does. You want to grab dinner this week? Catch up properly?" "I'd love that. Let me check my schedule and get back to you." "Sounds good. And Sandra? I'm proud to call you my friend." Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes, the good kind. "Same here, Keanu, same here." She set her phone down and sipped her tea, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Somewhere across the city, Victoria was probably still at the dealership, working late, thinking about everything that had happened. Robert was probably in his office, drafting plans for the new training program. Chris was probably telling his roommate or partner about the crazy day he'd had, about watching two movie stars teach his colleague a lesson in humanity. And tomorrow, Sandra's new car would be delivered. She'd inspect it carefully, make sure everything was as promised. She'd tip the delivery driver generously and probably offer them water or coffee. She'd treat them the way she wished everyone would treat everyone else, with basic kindness and respect. That night, before bed, Sandra found herself thinking about all the times in her life when she'd been misjudged or dismissed. Some of those times had been because people recognized her and made assumptions about celebrities. Other times, like today, it was because people didn't recognize her and made assumptions about regular-looking women. Neither felt good. Both said more about the people doing the judging than about her. But she'd also been lucky in her life. Lucky to have friends like Keanu who stood up for her. Lucky to have enough security and confidence to handle these situations with grace. Lucky to have a voice that people would listen to when she pointed out injustice. Not everyone had those advantages. That's what she'd been trying to get Victoria to understand. For every Sandra Bullock who gets ignored at a car dealership and has Keanu Reeves walk in to support her, there are 100 regular people who get ignored and have no one to stand up for them. Those were the people who really paid the price for assumptions and judgment. As Sandra drifted off to sleep that night, she made a small promise to herself. She'd pay more attention to those moments in her own life when she might be making assumptions about others. She'd work harder to see people as individuals rather than as categories. She'd try to be to others what Keanu had been to her today, someone willing to speak up when things weren't right. The next afternoon, right on schedule, the SUV was delivered. It was perfect, gleaming and beautiful with a huge bow on top that made Sandra laugh. The delivery driver was a young woman named Patricia, who seemed nervous about delivering a car to a celebrity's home. "It's beautiful," Sandra told her warmly. "Thank you so much for bringing it." "It's my job," Patricia said, but she smiled, relaxing slightly. "Well, you did a great job. Would you like some water before you head back?" Patricia looked surprised. "Oh, that's okay, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to, but it's hot out and you probably have more deliveries today. Come on, it'll just take a second." As Sandra poured a glass of cold water for Patricia, she thought about Victoria, about small moments of kindness and respect, about treating people like people rather than like inconveniences or transactions. Patricia thanked her for the water and left with a big smile, and Sandra stood in her driveway next to her new car feeling like maybe the world was a little bit better than it had been yesterday. Not perfect, not even close, but better. And that was something. Inside the house, her phone rang. It was Robert from the dealership. "Ms. Bullock, I wanted to personally confirm that your vehicle was delivered in perfect condition. Is everything to your satisfaction?" "It's wonderful, Robert. Thank you. I'm so glad." And I wanted you to know we had our first training session this morning. Victoria, Chris, and the rest of the sales team. We talked about unconscious bias, about assumptions, about treating every customer with dignity. It went really well. That's great to hear. Victoria asked me to tell you something, Robert continued. She helped a woman this morning who came in wearing workout clothes, looking like she'd just come from the gym. Victoria said normally she might have made assumptions, but instead she greeted her warmly and spent an hour helping her find the right car. The woman ended up buying a very expensive sedan and specifically mentioned how well she was treated. Sandra felt that warmth in her chest again, spreading through her whole body. That's wonderful. Really wonderful. Please tell Victoria I'm proud of her. I will, and thank you again, Ms. Bullock, for your grace and for pushing us to be better. After they hung up, Sandra went outside and sat in her new car. She adjusted the seat, familiarized herself with the controls, connected her phone to the Bluetooth system. Then she just sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, imagining all the places this car would take her. But more than that, she thought about the places yesterday's experience had taken Victoria and Robert and Chris and maybe even the people they'd interact with in the future. Ripples spreading out from one uncomfortable afternoon, potentially changing lives in small but meaningful ways. Sandra started the engine. It purred to life, smooth and quiet and powerful. She backed out of her driveway carefully, getting a feel for the vehicle. And as she drove through her neighborhood, she found herself smiling. Because sometimes, even when things start out badly, they can end up meaning something good. Sometimes being dismissed and ignored and judged can become an opportunity for growth, for change, for people to become better versions of themselves. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best lessons, and sometimes all it takes is someone willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right," and someone else willing to listen and actually hear it. Keanu had been that person for her. She'd been that person for Victoria in her own way, and hopefully Victoria would be that person for someone else someday. The story didn't end with confrontation or revenge or anyone being punished. It ended with understanding, growth, and the quiet hope that tomorrow might be a little better than yesterday. And really, Sandra thought as she drove toward the grocery store in her beautiful new car, that was the best kind of ending there was. Sandra settled into the comfortable chair and felt herself starting to relax for the first time since walking into the dealership. Robert had a calm, professional demeanor that immediately put her at ease. He wasn't trying too hard or being overly apologetic. He was just being present and attentive, which was exactly what she'd wanted from the beginning. "I need something reliable and spacious," Sandra began, leaning forward slightly. "I've got a lot of driving ahead of me over the next few months for work. Long days on set, early morning calls, sometimes traveling with equipment or other people. I was looking at SUVs because I need the cargo space, but I also want something comfortable, something that feels safe and handles well." Robert nodded, already making notes on a tablet. "Do you have a preference for any particular brands? Any features that are must-haves?" "Good safety ratings are non-negotiable," Sandra said. "Beyond that, I'm pretty open. I saw the silver SUV out there, the one I asked Victoria about. That caught my eye, but I'd love to hear what you think would work best for what I need." While they talked, Keanu wandered over to look at the photos on Robert's wall. "How long have you been managing this place?" he asked. 15 years, Robert replied. "Started as a salesperson myself, actually. Worked my way up." He paused, then added with visible regret, "Which is why what happened today bothers me so much. I remember what it was like being on the floor, talking to customers. I always tried to treat everyone the same way, whether they were buying a $50,000 sedan or a $300,000 sports car." "Sounds like you were good at it," Keanu observed. "I tried to be, and I thought I'd built that culture here, but clearly something's gotten lost along the way. We've been so focused on the luxury market, on big sales, that maybe we've forgotten how to be decent human beings first and salespeople second." Sandra appreciated his honesty. A lot of managers would have made excuses, blamed it all on Victoria, distanced themselves from the problem. But Robert was taking responsibility for the culture he'd allowed to develop, even if he hadn't been directly involved in what happened. "The silver SUV you mentioned is an excellent choice," Robert said, pulling up some information on his tablet. "But let me show you a couple of other options too. I want to make sure you're getting exactly what you need, not just what looks nice." For the next 20 minutes, they went through specifications, features, and options. Robert was knowledgeable without being condescending. He asked good questions about Sandra's actual needs rather than trying to upsell her on fancy extras she didn't want. Keanu chimed in occasionally with his own experience about different vehicle features, and Sandra found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. At one point, Robert's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned slightly. "Excuse me for just a moment," he said, stepping out of the office. Sandra and Keanu were left alone. She turned to her friend with a small smile. "Thanks for showing up when you did. I was about 2 minutes from just leaving. I'm glad I could help," Keanu said. "But you know you didn't really need me. You were handling it just fine on your own. Maybe, but it felt good to have backup." Sandra stretched in her chair. "You know what's weird? This happens more than people think. Not always this dramatically, but people make assumptions all the time about who I am, what I want, what I'm capable of, sometimes because they recognize me and have ideas about what movie stars are like, sometimes because they don't recognize me and judge based on something else. It's exhausting, isn't it?" Keanu said quietly. "Never quite being seen for who you actually are." "Exactly." Sandra was grateful he understood. "That's why I dress down when I can. I just want to be normal sometimes, you know? But then you get treated like this and it's like there's no winning. Either you're Sandra Bullock, the celebrity, and people treat you differently for that, or you're just some woman in jeans and people treat you differently for that." Robert came back in, looking a bit uncomfortable. "I'm sorry about that. Victoria wanted to know if she could speak with you again before you leave, Ms. Bullock. I told her I'd ask, but there's absolutely no pressure. If you'd rather not, I completely understand." Sandra considered this. "What does she want to say?" "I honestly don't know. But I think she's still processing everything. Sometimes it takes a while for these lessons to really sink in. Let her process on her own time," Keanu suggested gently. "Sandra doesn't owe her anything else." But Sandra shook her head. "No, it's okay. I'll talk to her before we leave. But let's finish this first. I'd really like to actually buy a car today if possible." Robert's relief was visible. "Absolutely. So based on what you've told me, I think I have the perfect option for you." They spent another 30 minutes going over the final details. Sandra test drove 2 different SUVs, both of which handled beautifully. Keanu came along for the test drives, sitting in the back and occasionally commenting on things like visibility and road noise. It felt less like a sales transaction and more like friends helping a friend make a good decision. Sandra ultimately chose a beautiful dark blue SUV with all the safety features she wanted and enough space for whatever she might need to haul around. The price was steep, but she'd been prepared for that. What she hadn't been prepared for was Robert offering her a substantial discount. "I appreciate the gesture," Sandra said carefully, "but I don't need special treatment. I can pay full price." Robert shook his head. "This isn't about special treatment. This is about making amends for wasting your time and treating you poorly. Please let me do this." Sandra exchanged a glance with Keanu, who shrugged as if to say it was her call. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but only if you promise me something." "What's that?" "That this actually changes things here. That the training you talked about actually happens. That Victoria gets a real chance to grow from this. And that the next person who walks in here in jeans and a ponytail gets treated with the same respect they would if they showed up in a tuxedo." "You have my word," Robert said solemnly, as Robert started preparing the paperwork. Keanu excused himself to go look at the motorcycles in the adjacent section. Sandra could hear him talking with one of the mechanics, his voice warm and interested as he asked questions about maintenance schedules. While she waited, Sandra found herself thinking about Victoria. The woman had made a mistake, a significant one, but she'd also seemed genuinely remorseful. Sandra had seen plenty of fake apologies in her life, the kind people gave because they had to, or because they wanted something. Victoria's had felt real. 20 minutes later, the paperwork was complete. Sandra had purchased a vehicle she genuinely loved, and arrangements had been made for it to be detailed and delivered to her home the following day. Robert walked her out to the main showroom where Keanu was waiting by the door. Victoria was there too, standing off to the side with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small and uncertain, so different from the confident saleswoman who'd dismissed Sandra earlier. When she saw Sandra, she straightened up slightly like she was gathering courage. "Ms. Bullock," she said quietly. "Do you have a moment?" Sandra nodded. "Of course. They stepped slightly away from the others, creating a pocket of semi-privacy in the corner of the showroom. Victoria took a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about all the other people I might have treated this way, people who weren't famous, who didn't have someone to stand up for them. Her voice was steady but emotional. I went through my sales records from the past year. I looked at how many people I actually helped versus how many people I probably dismissed based on appearance, and the numbers are horrible. Sandra listened quietly, letting Victoria work through this. I told myself I was being efficient, that I was prioritizing real buyers, but I was just being judgmental and lazy, and I was making assumptions that said more about my own biases than anything else. Victoria met Sandra's eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive me or to feel sorry for me. I just wanted you to know that this mattered. What happened today mattered. And it's going to change how I do my job from now on. I believe you, Sandra said simply, and I think you're taking the right first steps. But Victoria, this can't just be about feeling bad for a few days and then going back to normal. Real change is hard. It requires constant attention and effort. I know. Robert and I have already started planning the training program, and I've asked him to review my performance more closely, to call me out if he sees me falling into old patterns. Victoria smiled slightly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. It's going to be uncomfortable, but I deserve to be uncomfortable, and more importantly, future customers deserve better. Sandra felt that warmth in her chest again, the same feeling she'd had when she overheard Chris apologizing to the couple. For what it's worth, she said, I hope this works out for you. I hope you become the kind of salesperson who treats everyone well. Not because you might get in trouble if you don't, but because you genuinely care about people. That's the goal, Victoria said softly. Thank you for giving Robert permission to keep me on. A lot of people in your position would have demanded I be fired. That wouldn't have helped anyone learn anything, Sandra replied. Besides, everybody deserves a second chance. Keanu gave Sandra a gentle smile, the kind that reached his eyes and reminded her why they'd been friends for so long. You came here for a reason, he said softly. Don't let one person's mistake take that away from you. But it's your call. Sandra took a deep breath. She looked at Robert, who was waiting anxiously for her answer. She looked at Victoria, who seemed to be holding her breath. Then she looked back at the silver SUV she'd been admiring before all of this started. It really was exactly what she'd been looking for. All right, she said finally, but I'd prefer to work with you directly, Robert. No offense intended, but I think Victoria and I both need some space from each other right now. Of course, Robert said quickly. Absolutely. And again, I'm so sorry. He gestured toward his office. Why don't we go somewhere more comfortable to talk about what you're looking for? Before they could move, Victoria spoke up. Her voice was shaky, and when Sandra looked at her, she could see the woman's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Ms. Bullock, I need to say something, please. Sandra stopped. Part of her wanted to just walk away, to let Victoria stew in her embarrassment and move on with her day. But another part of her, the part that had always tried to see the humanity in people even when they hadn't shown it to her, made her stay. I was wrong, Victoria said, the words tumbling out quickly. I was so wrong, and I'm not saying that because I know who you are now. I'm saying it because I treated you horribly and you didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I've been working here for 3 years, and I've gotten so focused on hitting my numbers and making my commission that I forgot the most basic thing about this job. People. Real people walk through that door every day, and I've been judging them like I have any right to decide who's worthy of my attention. The showroom was still silent. Even the couple who'd been looking at the convertible had stopped pretending not to listen. Chris, the younger salesperson, was watching Victoria with something like shock on his face. He'd never seen her like this, vulnerable and admitting fault. I saw your jeans and your ponytail, Victoria continued, her voice breaking slightly, and I decided you weren't worth my time. I assumed you couldn't afford anything here, and that says so much more about me than it does about you. I'm ashamed of myself, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sandra studied Victoria for a long moment. She could tell the apology was genuine, that the tears weren't for show. Victoria was having a real moment of clarity about her behavior, and Sandra recognized it because she'd seen it before. Sometimes people needed to hit rock bottom before they could see how far they'd fallen. I appreciate you saying that, Sandra said carefully, and I accept your apology. But Victoria, You need to understand something. This isn't about me being a celebrity or about you missing out on a big sale. This is about the fact that you do this. You just admitted you judge people when they walk in. How many other people have you treated this way? How many regular folks who aren't famous and don't have someone like Keanu walking in to stand up for them? Victoria's face crumpled. I don't know, she whispered. Too many, probably. Keanu, who'd been quietly observing this exchange, spoke up again. His voice was thoughtful, like he was working through something as he talked. I've bought a lot of vehicles in my life. Motorcycles, cars, you name it. And I can tell you, the best salespeople I've ever worked with weren't the ones who recognized me or fawned over me. They were the ones who treated everyone the same way. With patience, with respect, with genuine interest in helping them find what they needed. He looked at Victoria, and there wasn't anger in his expression, just honesty. You can be good at your job and still treat people well. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I'd argue you can't really be good at your job unless you treat people well, because this job is about people. Robert had been listening to all of this, and Sandra could see him processing it. He was a manager, which meant he was probably thinking about training, about policies, about how to prevent this from happening again. But he was also clearly moved by what Keanu was saying. You're right, Robert said. And this is on me too. I've been so focused on sales numbers and quarterly goals that maybe I haven't been paying enough attention to how those numbers are being achieved. He looked at Victoria, then at Chris, then at the other salespeople who'd gathered around. We're going to make some changes around here. Starting immediately. Sandra felt Keanu's hand on her shoulder, a gentle reminder that they could still leave if she wanted to. But she found herself curious now about what Robert meant by changes. And besides, she really did need that car. What kind of changes? She asked. Robert thought for a moment before answering. Well, for starters, we're going to implement mandatory customer service training. Not just the basics, but real training about unconscious bias, about treating every customer with dignity regardless of how they look or dress. We're going to review our sales culture and make sure we're not inadvertently encouraging this kind of behavior. That sounds good, Keanu said, but training only works if people actually want to change. You're right, Robert agreed. He looked at Victoria again. Victoria, I'm not firing you, but you're going to be the first one to go through this new training, and you're going to help me develop it, because you now understand firsthand what happens when we fail at basic human decency. Can you do that? Victoria nodded, wiping her eyes again. Yes, absolutely, I want to do better. I need to do better. Sandra watched this exchange with interest. She'd expected Victoria to be fired on the spot, honestly. That's usually what happened in situations like this when someone important was involved. The fact that Robert was choosing a different path, one focused on education and growth rather than just punishment, impressed her. I think that's a good approach, Sandra said to Robert. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and improve. I've made my share of mistakes over the years, and I'm grateful to the people who gave me opportunities to grow from them rather than just writing me off. Keanu smiled at her, that warm, genuine smile that had made audiences fall in love with him decades ago. That's very gracious of you, Sandra shrugged. I'm not trying to ruin anyone's life here. I just wanted to buy a car. She glanced at Victoria one more time. But I hope you really do learn from this. Not because I'm someone famous, but because there are probably dozens of regular people who've walked through here and been made to feel small. They deserve better. They do, Victoria said quietly. And I'm going to do better. I promise. The tension in the showroom had shifted. It wasn't completely gone, but it had changed from hostile and uncomfortable to something more hopeful. Sandra could see it in the way people's shoulders had relaxed slightly, in the way Chris was looking at Victoria with something like respect now, instead of shock. Robert gestured toward his office again. Ms. Bullock, if you're still willing, I'd love to help you find the perfect vehicle. And Mr. Reeves, you're welcome to join us if you'd like. Actually, Keanu said, I should probably look at what I came here for too. Some maintenance questions about my motorcycle. But I'll stick around for a bit if that's okay with you, Sandra. Please do, Sandra said. She felt better with him there, like having a friend nearby made the whole situation less surreal. As they started to walk toward Robert's office, Sandra noticed the couple who'd been looking at the convertible were now talking quietly with Chris. The young salesperson looked nervous but determined, and Sandra caught a bit of their conversation as she passed. I want to apologize too, Chris was saying to the couple. I saw what was happening earlier and I didn't say anything. I should have offered to help Miss Bullock when Victoria wasn't. That's on me and I'm sorry. The woman in the couple smiled at him. We all make mistakes. What matters is that you recognize it. Sandra felt a small warmth in her chest. Maybe this really would lead to positive change. Maybe Victoria's mistake and this uncomfortable confrontation would actually make things better for future customers. That would be something good coming out of something bad. Robert held the door to his office open and Sandra stepped inside. It was a nice office, not overly flashy but comfortable. There were photos on the walls of Robert with various cars and a few industry awards on a shelf. He gestured to a comfortable chair and Sandra sat down while Keanu leaned against the wall nearby. So, Robert said, settling into his own chair behind the desk. Tell me about what you're looking for. What brought you in today? Keanu Reeves had one of those faces that made people do a double take, not because he tried to stand out, but because there was something genuinely kind in his expression that you didn't see very often. He'd stopped by the dealership to ask about maintenance on his motorcycle, something he did regularly because he actually cared about keeping his vehicles in good shape. He wasn't the type to just throw money at problems. He liked to understand how things worked. When he walked through those doors and spotted Sandra sitting alone in the waiting area, his whole face lit up. They'd known each other for years, had worked on several films together, and had maintained one of those rare Hollywood friendships that was actually real. No pretense, no networking, just two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and respected each other's work. Sandra stood up as he approached, and they hugged the way old friends do when they haven't seen each other in a while. It wasn't one of those quick, polite hugs you give at industry events. It was warm and real, the kind of embrace that says you actually care about the other person. I haven't seen you in months, Keanu said, pulling back to look at her properly. How have you been? What brings you to this place? Before Sandra could answer, she noticed the shift in the showroom. Victoria had frozen mid-sentence in her conversation with the couple. Another salesperson who'd been organizing paperwork at a desk looked up sharply. Even the businessman in the corner had turned to look, because while they might not have recognized Sandra in her casual clothes, everybody knew Keanu Reeves. It was fascinating and a little sad to watch. The same people who'd ignored her for 30 minutes were now very interested in what was happening in the waiting area. Victoria in particular looked like she'd just swallowed something bitter. Her face had gone pale and she was staring at Sandra with what appeared to be growing horror, but Sandra wasn't focused on them. She was talking to her friend, telling him about her disappointing morning with that characteristic grace she brought to everything. She didn't complain or get dramatic about it. She just explained matter-of-factly that she'd come in to buy a car but hadn't been able to get anyone's attention. I've been here for half an hour, she said with a slight laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. I even asked directly about one of the SUVs, and let's just say the response wasn't what I'd hoped for. Keanu's expression changed. The warmth remained, but something else entered his eyes. Disappointment maybe, or a quiet frustration at hearing his friend had been treated poorly. He'd always been someone who stood up for others, who noticed when things weren't right and actually did something about it, not in a loud or showy way, but with a gentle firmness that somehow carried more weight than any amount of yelling would have. What happened exactly? He asked, his voice calm but serious. Sandra hesitated. She wasn't the type to cause trouble or get people in difficulty, but Keanu was looking at her with such genuine concern that she found herself explaining the whole thing. The ignored eye contact, the dismissive attitude, and especially that comment about trying the Toyota dealership down the road. As she talked, she could see Keanu processing it all, his jaw tightening slightly. That's not okay, he said simply. That's not how people should be treated. From across the showroom, Victoria had finally gotten her legs to work. She'd excused herself from the couple and was making her way toward them, though she looked like she was walking toward her own execution. Her confident stride from earlier had been replaced with hesitant steps. She kept smoothing down her blazer, a nervous gesture that gave away how rattled she was. The other salesperson, a younger guy named Chris, was watching the whole thing unfold with wide eyes. He'd only been working there for 6 months and had looked up to Victoria as someone who knew how to work the floor and close deals. But even he could see that something had gone terribly wrong. Victoria finally reached them, and the professional smile she'd mastered over years of sales work was struggling to stay in place. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and Sandra could see them trembling slightly. Mr. Reeves, Victoria began, her voice higher than normal. It's wonderful to see you again. I didn't realize you were friends with... She stopped, finally turning her full attention to Sandra for the first time since she'd walked in. And Sandra watched as recognition dawned across Victoria's face like a very unpleasant sunrise. Oh my God, Victoria whispered. You're Sandra Bullock. There was a moment of silence. Sandra didn't say anything, just looked at Victoria with those intelligent, expressive eyes that had captivated audiences for decades. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even particularly upset anymore. She just looked tired, like this was a scene she'd played out too many times before. Keanu stepped in, his voice gentle but clear. Sandra's been here for what, 30 minutes? He glanced at Sandra, who nodded, and in that time nobody helped her. In fact, when she asked for help, she was told to try a different dealership. He paused, letting that sink in. That's not about recognition, Victoria. That's about respect. Victoria's face flushed red. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I didn't recognize her. I thought she was just... I get a lot of people who come in just to look, who aren't really serious about buying, and I have to prioritize my time with customers who look like they have money. Keanu finished quietly. Victoria flinched. That's not what I meant, isn't it though? Keanu wasn't being cruel. His tone remained calm and reasonable, which somehow made his words more powerful. Because Sandra walked in here ready to spend a significant amount of money on a vehicle she needs. She dressed comfortably because she was having a casual day, and she was judged, dismissed, and insulted based on her appearance. By now, the other people in the showroom weren't even pretending not to listen. The couple had stopped looking at cars entirely. The businessman had moved closer, clearly interested in this drama unfolding. Even Chris had abandoned his paperwork to watch. The showroom manager, Robert Chen, emerged from his office in the back. He was in his mid-50s with silver hair and the kind of presence that comes from years of successfully running a business. He'd heard raised voices. Well, Keanu's voice wasn't exactly raised, but he'd heard the serious tone, and his instincts told him something was wrong. Is everything all right here? Robert asked, looking between Victoria, Keanu, and Sandra. Keanu turned to him, and Sandra noticed how he positioned himself slightly between her and the others. Not in an aggressive way, but protective, like he wanted to make sure she felt supported. I'm Keanu Reeves, he said, extending his hand to Robert, who shook it while clearly trying to figure out what was happening. And this is Sandra Bullock. She came in today hoping to buy a vehicle, but she's been ignored and treated dismissively for the past half hour. I think there might be a problem with how your staff evaluates potential customers. Robert's expression shifted from confused to concerned to horrified in the space of about 3 seconds. He looked at Sandra, really looked at her, and Sandra could see him making the same journey Victoria had just made. Recognition, realization, and then a dawning understanding of just how badly this situation had been handled. Ms. Bullock, he said, his voice sincere. I'm Robert Chen, the manager here. I'm so incredibly sorry for your experience. This is absolutely not how we do business, and I want to make this right. Victoria stood there looking like she wanted the polished floor to open up and swallow her whole. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated. She was wringing her hands now, her eyes darting between Robert, Sandra, and Keanu, probably trying to figure out how much trouble she was in and whether she was about to lose her job. Sandra finally spoke, her voice kind despite everything. I appreciate that, Robert. I really do. But I have to be honest, the experience has left a pretty bad taste. I came in excited about getting a new car, and instead I spent half an hour feeling invisible and then being told I couldn't afford what you're selling. Robert looked at Victoria, and the disappointment in his face was clear. Did you really tell Ms. Bullock to try another dealership? Victoria's silence was answer enough. I think, Keanu said carefully, this might be a good opportunity for some reflection on how assumptions can hurt both customers and business. Because Sandra isn't upset that she wasn't recognized. She's upset that basic courtesy wasn't extended to her as a human being who walked through your doors. The showroom had gone completely quiet. Everyone was watching this unfold like it was a scene from a movie. And in a way, it was. Two of Hollywood's most beloved actors, standing in a car dealership teaching an impromptu lesson on dignity and respect. It wasn't the kind of thing that happened every day. Robert nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through how to handle this situation. "You're absolutely right," he said to Keanu, then turned to Sandra. "Ms. Bullock, would you give us another chance? Would you allow me to personally help you find the vehicle you're looking for? I promise you'll receive the service you should have received from the moment you walked in." Sandra looked at Keanu, a question in her eyes. Should she stay? Should she give them another chance? Was it worth it? It was one of those perfect Tuesday afternoons in Beverly Hills. The sun was shining, the streets were clean, and everything looked like it belonged in a magazine. Sandra Bullock pulled into the parking lot of one of the most exclusive luxury car dealerships in the city. She'd been thinking about getting a new vehicle for weeks now, something reliable and comfortable for all the driving she'd be doing for her upcoming projects. She stepped out of her older car and took a moment to stretch. She was dressed simply that day, wearing her favorite pair of well-worn jeans, a comfortable sweater, and sneakers. No makeup, no fancy jewelry, just her natural self. After spending so many years in the spotlight, she'd learned to treasure these moments when she could just be herself without all the glamour and fuss. It felt good to have a day where she wasn't Sandra Bullock, the movie star, just Sandra looking for a good car. The dealership looked impressive from the outside. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed off rows of gleaming vehicles that probably cost more than most people's houses. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped inside. The air conditioning hit her immediately, a welcome relief from the California heat. The showroom was massive, with polished floors that reflected the overhead lights and made everything look even more expensive than it already was. There were only a handful of people inside. A couple was looking at a convertible in the far corner, their excited voices echoing slightly in the big space. An older gentleman in a sharp suit was talking to a salesman near the back. And then there was the woman behind the main desk, a saleswoman named Victoria Rodriguez who had been working there for about 3 years. Victoria looked up when Sandra walked in. Their eyes met for just a second and Sandra smiled, the kind of friendly smile you give someone when you're hoping for a little help. But Victoria's expression barely changed. She glanced at Sandra, taking in the casual outfit, the messy ponytail, the complete lack of designer labels. Then she looked away, turning her attention to some papers on her desk. Sandra figured Victoria might be busy, so she started walking around on her own. She made her way slowly through the showroom, running her hand along the smooth paint of a beautiful black SUV. The vehicles were stunning, each one more impressive than the last. She'd done her research online, knew roughly what she wanted, but there's something different about seeing these cars in person. The weight of the doors, the smell of the leather, the way the steering wheel feels in your hands. She spent a good 10 minutes just looking around, occasionally glancing toward Victoria, hoping to catch her eye. But the saleswoman seemed determined to be busy with anything except helping the casually dressed woman wandering around her showroom. At one point, Victoria got up from her desk and walked right past Sandra to greet the well-dressed businessman. Sandra could hear her voice, suddenly warm and enthusiastic, asking him what brought him in today and how she could help him find his dream car. Sandra felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. She'd experienced this before, more times than she cared to count. People making assumptions based on how she looked, judging her worth by her appearance rather than actually talking to her. It never stopped being disappointing even after all these years. She kept browsing, trying to give Victoria the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she really was busy. Maybe she had strict rules about who to approach first. Maybe Sandra was just being too sensitive. But 20 minutes passed and Victoria hadn't so much as glanced in her direction again. The businesswoman had moved on to help the couple with the convertible, her laughter ringing out across the showroom as they chatted like old friends. Finally, Sandra decided to take matters into her own hands. She walked directly over to where Victoria was standing, waiting politely for a break in the conversation. When Victoria finally turned to her, Sandra kept her voice friendly and hopeful. "Hi there, I was wondering if you could tell me about that SUV over there." "The silver one? I'm really interested in learning more about it." Victoria's response was quick and cold. She barely looked at Sandra as she spoke. "Those start at $150,000, she said, her tone making it clear what she thought about Sandra's ability to afford that price tag. "If you're looking for something more in your range, there's a Toyota dealership about 10 minutes down the road. They have some nice used options." The words hung in the air between them. Sandra felt her cheeks flush, not from embarrassment about money, but from the sheer rudeness of the assumption. She'd walked in ready to spend well over $200,000 on the right vehicle. and she was being sent to look at used cars based on nothing but her outfit. "I see," Sandra said quietly, her smile fading. "Thank you for your time." Victoria had already turned away, dismissing her completely. Sandra stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of her wanted to say something, to call out the terrible treatment, to make Victoria understand how wrong she was. But another part of her, the part that had dealt with this kind of thing for years, just felt tired. She walked over to the waiting area and sat down in one of the plush leather chairs. She pulled out her phone, scrolling mindlessly through emails while trying to figure out her next move. Should she leave? Should she try another dealership? Should she ask to speak to a manager? The cars here were exactly what she'd been looking for, and it frustrated her that one person's poor attitude might keep her from getting what she needed. From where she sat, she could see Victoria moving around the showroom. The saleswoman looked confident, maybe even a little smug. She was helping the couple now, showing them features and probably making a nice commission on whatever they decided to buy. At one point, Victoria said something to another salesperson, and they both glanced in Sandra's direction before laughing quietly. Sandra couldn't hear what was said, but she could imagine. She thought about all the times she'd been treated differently once people realized who she was. The sudden rush of attention, the over-the-top courtesy, the way people's entire demeanor would change in an instant. It always felt fake, like she only mattered because of her fame. What she wanted, what she'd always wanted, was to be treated like everyone else. To walk into a store and receive basic kindness and respect, not because of her name or her face, but just because she was a human being who deserved it. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, being ignored because Victoria didn't recognize her, when all she wanted was to be treated well regardless of whether she was recognized or not. It seemed impossible to find that middle ground where she was just another customer, worthy of attention and respect without any fuss. She was about to get up and leave when she heard the showroom doors open behind her. She didn't turn around at first, too lost in her own thoughts. But then she heard a familiar voice, warm and genuine, calling out her name with obvious delight. "Sandra, what are you doing here?" She turned around, and despite everything, she couldn't help but smile. Walking toward her with his characteristic easy stride was Keanu Reeves, looking exactly like himself in his simple black jacket and worn jeans. And suddenly, the whole disappointing afternoon was about to take a very different turn.